So very quickly, what are we doing right now? We're doing lots of good things. The Obama administration has generated perhaps more ideas than they can possibly implement, but we're not doing one big thing on the civil society side. Overall, aid to the Middle East is up from 2011, 12, 13. It's been adding $1 billion a year. The request for FY13 is $9 billion, up from $7 billion just 2 years ago. But if we look at it, we have to kind of realize how complicated this has been bureaucratically for the Obama administration. The largest increase in funding is still in the peace and security arena, not in education, health, empowerment of individuals, et cetera. And to fund the new incentive fund, this $700 million fund that Congress has still not approved, that would go largely to Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, that fund, they had to reallocate from other accounts. So I was startled to see that we are actually dropping funding in education in order to channel more funding towards activities that would stabilize the economies and do job creation in the region. Sometimes the efforts of the U.S. government get very diffused, where funding is insufficient to achieve critical mass, but we still feel like we have to reach out and touch as many different constituencies as we can. We are operating sometimes in a murky legal environment where countries are rethinking their NGO laws of what is permitted, how does foreign money get received and used, et cetera. And let me just focus on education for a minute. There is some attention to underrepresented groups for scholarships. There's an effort to try to plus up money for scholarships, and I see Bill Reuel and others who have worked very diligently over the years to expand educational exchanges between the United States and the Middle East. And for my money, there's nothing that's more valuable than that. But as I said, the funding for education has dropped. There's some anecdotal reporting that numbers of Arab students able to come wanting and able to come to the United States are back up to earlier numbers of a decade ago. The demand for U.S.-style education in the region is high. We see countries investing in American-style universities in their own countries. And new programs funded by the Arabs themselves, whether it's the Saudi government or the Qatari government, the Egyptian government, looking to fund very quickly training opportunities to advance people educationally. The Iraqis have done the same thing, dedicating money to get their best students out of Iraq to Western countries to develop some of the high-tech skills they know they need. So the picture is mixed in some ways. Let me just give you very quickly to give you the flavor of how diverse the activities are at present. In Tunisia, for example, where the administration was uniquely successful in freeing up some funds before Congress had second thoughts about new money for the Middle East countries in transition, we have allocated, I think, roughly $100 million over 2 years for everything from direct budget support, training their ICT sector, returning the Peace Corps, training entrepreneurs, setting up a U.S.-Tunisian enterprise fund, allowing the Tunisians to be qualified as an MCC country, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, advising their constitutional program, and even, and this one was rather touching, it was covered in the news yesterday, micro-entrepreneur funds to fruit vendors and to people like the late Mr. Bouazizi, trying to capture how much the informal sector is really where a lot of employment is, and instead of expecting people to be able to move to the more formal economic sector, to try to facilitate and support the micro-entrepreneurs. So that's just one example. In Egypt, we're trying very hard to help them with debt relief, but there is resistance on the U.S. side, also focused on educational reform, giving voice to women, refugee rights, training journalists. But again, in Egypt, overwhelmingly, the peace and security pillar dominates our funding, and only $200 million in the last year or two has been for civilian, economic, and political reform activities. Let me just finish by saying I think there's a lot of hard work ahead to reconceptualize our engagement. I know that some of the major American actors, from the NED to Freedom House and others, really are in a period of transition in terms of what what is the right size of their presence, how do they engage with the local actors, how do we ensure that this be as locally owned and led as possible. We do need to be careful and try to strike a new balance between what their market demands, what our public and Congress think is right, and what resources are available. These are hybrid relationships. They are not exclusively in the private or the public domain. I think it's good for our government and their governments to enable and support these civil society relationships. It's not a substitute for wise policies at the strategic level, but it is an integral part of how these societies perceive the U.S. and the American agenda. So in the long term, I think this is a proud and grounded component of U.S. influence and engagement in the region. Thanks.
I'd like to thank Ellen, welcome our moderator, Deborah Jones, to the stage, and welcome Daniel Brumberg to the front.
Well, very good morning to everyone, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak with you this morning. Special treat to see Larry on this panel. I called him up in 1982 when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago and got some insights from him, so that'll put us in the time framework here. I'm going to speak mostly about dynamics of transitions in the region and their implications for U.S.-Arab relations. I'd be happy to speak a little later or address issues on Iran. I've worked a great deal on issues having to do with Iran, and Ellen and I have worked together on these matters quite closely over the years. And of course, at USIP, I'm very much engaged on the soft power arena. We are heavily involved now in Tunisia, and particularly in academic programs. So, be happy to address those issues. But I'm going to focus now, and I suppose my thesis. I'm going to actually read something I prepared. But my overall thesis, which will hardly surprise you, is that I think the region is engulfed in a transition in which identity issues are coming to the fore, particularly, but not exclusively, conflict and competition between Islamists and seculars and between Islamists and Islamists. And that presents the U.S. with a very difficult set of challenges and how to handle these sort of escalating conflicts. Even in Tunisia, where we thought Tunisia was going to be the easy case. But there, the escalation, particularly of conflict within the Islamist camp and then between Islamists and secularists, has gotten really much more serious and posing all kinds of dilemmas for leaders there, as well as for the United States and its diplomacy. There was a time not too long ago when the Arab world was seen as resistant to a third wave of democracy, one that was supposedly sweeping the globe. However, by the end of the 90s, the persistence of autocracy in the Arab world appeared to be anything but unique. Indeed, the emerging consensus in the academic community was that semi-autocracy, or what Tom Carruthers called the gray zone between liberal democracy and full authoritarianism, had become the rule rather than the exception. This proliferation of semi-autocracy was fostered by the collapse of the Cold War order. Indeed, if the post-Cold War map was still dominated by the military superiority of the U.S., it was also marked by the growing influence of what Charlie Kupchan calls the rest, and by a new pattern of strategic and political economic cooperation that pivoted around a loose alliance of authoritarian regimes led by Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela. The resulting dynamic of global and regional competition abetted the efforts of semi-authoritarian regimes to play as many global economic, political, and strategic cards as possible in ways designed to enhance their room for maneuver. The 2001 Arab uprisings have tossed a monkey wrench into this messy system, but has also done so in ways that resist both the heady democratic universalism that some analysts articulated during the early months of the Arab uprisings, and the growing pessimism we now hear, particularly from those who view democratization as little more than the inevitable prelude to anti-Western and anti-Israeli governments. Neither of these two contending or opposed theories or positions grasp the ambiguities, complexities, and contradictions that will mark the Arab domestic politics and foreign policy for some time to come. To understand why, we have to review the mechanisms that sustain Arab autocracies, as well as the new forces that have undermined them. Prior to the 2001 uprisings, Arab autocracies survived not only by using robust repressive machines, but also by manipulating the arenas of economic and identity conflict. In the economic realm, neo-market reforms enlarged a class of crony businessmen with deep ties to the bureaucracy. In the identity arena, the manipulation of identity conflicts created a protection racket politics designed to enhance the autonomy of regimes. In fully authoritarian regimes, Arab rulers gained the support of their vulnerable minorities, such as secularists, by shielding them from the threat of democratic competition. But this kind of full or nearly full political exclusion, of course exclusion in this case of Islamists, as exemplified in Tunisia, was the exception. In an age of semi-authoritarianism, the preferable strategy was to allow for a measure of state-controlled de facto political inclusion sufficiently wide such that regimes could manipulate one group against the other. To varying degrees, this was the game in Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, and Kuwait. Now, the Arab uprisings signaled the erosion, fast, slow, or intermediate, of these protection racket politics. This trend was partly a consequence of the efforts of old and new generation activists to forge a more unified front in opposition to autocracy. Indeed, during the late 90s and beyond, the proliferation of Islamist secular dialogues and informal pact-making in Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and to some extent Yemen signaled that groups that had previously sought the shield of Arab autocracies now were seeking to create a common umbrella of democratic protection by cooperating with one another. Now, whether such cross-cutting alliances will survive, or the efforts to create such alliances between Islamists and secularists, will survive the test of actual democratic politics remains to be seen. But what is clear is that the 2001 uprisings have precluded a full return or the reinvention of the old protection racket politics game. What does this new inchoate political map mean for the U.S. in terms of our diplomacy and our wider foreign policy? First and foremost, political change has brought to the fore new leaders who are now accountable to an emerging electorate. This means that foreign policy is being democratized, or at the very least linked to public opinion in a structured and direct way. The notion that democratization will pull Arab societies inward, thus depreciating or obscuring foreign policy issues, may be a comforting thought for some, but it is not the case. Second, democratization of foreign policy will complicate the domestic politics and diplomacy of new democratic Arab leaders in ways that will generate challenges for the U.S. as well. On this score, Egypt is a paramount example. Egypt's new leaders must walk a fine line. On the one hand, they are under pressure to demonstrate a more independent or nationalist regional and global policy. This means reaching out to regional and global actors such as Turkey, Iran, and of course China, in ways that will enhance their diplomatic room for maneuver. On the other hand, these same new leaders cannot literally afford to antagonize Egypt's key strategic ally, the U.S., or to jettison a peace treaty with Israel, which at the very least has allowed Egypt to avoid being dragged into the front lines of a new Arab-Israeli military conflict. Morsi's much-discussed trip to Iran illustrates how tricky it is to walk this fine line. Note that before he went to Tehran, he visited China, where he obtained investment support. Then Morsi went to Tehran. But if he used the voyage to signal Egypt's new independence from the West, he also used it to indirectly chide the Iranian government for support of Assad and his henchmen.